Hi, everyone. My name is Miri Park, and I am the person who decided that we should all collectively read Black Reconstruction in America together. And I'm here today to introduce Robin D.G. Kelley and Shamel Bell. Um, I was inspired to start this project because I took class with Robin last winter at UCLA in his graduate seminar, African American Historiography. And this was the very, very first book that he had us all read in class. I commute an hour to and from UCLA, and so the only way that I could really read the book was to hear it on Audible. And when I was not in my car, I was also reading along while I was listening to it. And so that, coupled with taking his seminar, was a really profound experience for me, because it felt like all of the things that W.B. Du Bois discussed in Black Reconstruction was talking about the present moment, even though he had been writing about something that was over a century old in America. And so I kind of wanted to gift that experience to others, and called upon some friends in the performance community who I'm connected with. And so that has resulted in the read-in series, Black Reconstruction in America. And so I just wanted to introduce Dr. Shamel Bell, who is a recent UCLA PhD graduate of the World Arts and Cultures / Dance program. She is currently on faculty at Dartmouth and is about to begin teaching as well at Harvard. And she has written, I say written in air quotes, because her body has also written a history and understanding of what street dance activism can be. And she is one of the folks who has inspired a movement that we now call street dance activism in a more organized way. So if folks want to check that out, this is this project is in conjunction with street dance activism, and you can check out streetdanceactivism.com. Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley is the Carrie B. Nash Endowed Professor at UCLA in the history department. And he has written an enormous oeuvre of books dealing with African-American culture and history, including Freedom Dreams, a book that I quoted in my master's thesis, Yo Mama is Dysfunctional. Yeah. And he's influenced a lot of the generation of scholars and junior scholars that I am in cohort with. So it's a true honor. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me today to introduce this text. And so I think what I'm gonna ask Robin, if you can help us contextualize the importance of Du Bois's work. And then Shamel, if you want to take over in terms of asking specific questions, I hand it over to you.
Right. Well, thank you, Mary. Now I know why you were one of the few people who spoke in the discussion, because you actually read the book. Because what happens, I sign that book, I usually do it over 2 weeks, and I could say that maybe 15-20% read the book, but that's okay.
You are so much smarter than me, Mary. I wish I did that, because I was reading and in his office every single week, like with a big Post-it notes and everything. So you are a genius.
Yeah, well, no, but you both are, because you both actually read the book. But speaking of reading the book, so let me give some context for this, because Black Reconstruction is probably more popular now, or at least in the last 10 years or so, than it has been in decades. And I'm not going to repeat the basic argument of the book. I mean, we could discuss that in a conversation, but I just want to talk a little bit about the genesis of it, because actually it says something about when it was written, why it was relevant in the 1930s, and how that relates to today. So, Du Bois was born in 1868. So he was, born in Massachusetts. He didn't really experience the kind of direct violent racism growing up, in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And that actually made it more palpable for him, to grow up and to study and to understand things that he didn't exactly experience, although he was a child of that generation. So imagine, here he is, the first Black person to get a PhD from Harvard, He writes history, he writes about the slave trade, and he began writing about Reconstruction on and off beginning in 1901. He actually wrote an essay on the Freedmen's Bureau that was published in Atlantic Monthly that ended up in Souls of Black Folks. And then he gave a paper in 1909 at the American Historical Association, basically throwing down the gauntlet and critiquing everyone who's written about Reconstruction up to that point. And the paper was, well received. It was called Reconstruction and Its Benefits. And his basic argument was that Reconstruction wasn't this terrible thing, that actually Black and some white legislators actually created a set of democratic institutions and social institutions that people actually needed. Hospitals, public schools, that sort of thing. And then he kind of left it alone. He continued to do his work. He was editor of The Crisis. And all this work kept coming out under a scholar at Columbia University named William Dunning. And I want to emphasize this because Harvard, Columbia, Princeton, where this guy named Woodrow Wilson was a professor of history, who ended up becoming president, they wrote this vicious attacks on Reconstruction as not just failures, but as failures because Black people held the reins of power in certain areas. They never really held the reins of power fully, but that it was a failure and that it required white Southerners, the former planter class, to save the day and restore order, law and order, in the same way that Mike Pence is talking about it today. So the Klan became celebrated in that historiography. So this is all being written. And then this guy named Claude Bowers writes a book that's a runaway bestseller called The Tragic Era, which is almost like a distillation of all this scholarship, right? That basically celebrates the Klan, that celebrates the redemption, that is white supremacists coming back to power, the overthrow of the Reconstruction experiment in democracy. And that book comes out and it's selling and people are talking about it. And this is like right around the time on the eve of the collapse of the stock market. So there's an amazing Black woman historian, Black feminist, named Anna Julia Cooper. Anna Julia Cooper writes a letter to Du Bois and says, brother, you need to respond. You need to write something in response to Claude Bowers. And he did. He went to the drawing board and he went to the foundation, got some money, took a leave of absence from his job as editor of The Crisis, went to Atlanta University, and the first thing he did was read Marx. He felt like there was something in Marx. He read Capital, Volume 1, and he read as much as he could to understand Reconstruction. And of course, he read the congressional hearings. He read everything he could find, and he wrote that book. Now, why now? So think about this. So the book is written 1935, it comes out. It was ridiculed, it was ignored, it wasn't reviewed in some of the major historical journals. I mean, some people liked it. I mean, I don't want to say it was completely dismissed, but the professional historians basically dismissed it. Even the leftists dismissed it. It doesn't make a comeback until the 1960s. The 60s is when Black Reconstruction becomes, I wouldn't say exalted, but it's certainly recovered and respected and acknowledged as a pioneering work. And it was seen by liberal historians, revisionist liberal historians, that it wasn't all that bad. Now, why is that? Well, there's two things that are happening. One, you have a civil rights movement. And that civil rights movement in some ways is a mirror or echo of Reconstruction. Because what are they fighting for? The civil rights movement is a complicated thing. That's for another conversation. But one of the main things they're fighting for is for the restoration of the Reconstruction legislation, the Reconstruction Acts. That is to say, the amendments to the Constitution, like the 13th Amendment, 14th and 15th Amendments, granting citizenship rights for Black people, the right to vote, basic things like that. And so they start calling civil rights movement the second Reconstruction. which forces a kind of reassessment of that moment. And so going back to read Du Bois, what liberals read in Du Bois was Black agency, that Black people had the agency to fight for these legislative changes and fight for justice. In other words, to make America what it should have been all along. That's the liberal interpretation, okay? Dr. King gave a beautiful speech in 1968 before he died, basically saying, you know, Black Reconstruction is one of the great texts of all time. Now, there's another segment, and that is a kind of radical interpretation of Black Reconstruction, which emerges in the 1960s. They saw the radical politics. They saw he was wrestling with Marxism and class struggle. Even if you didn't read the book, you read chapters that refer to the dictatorship of the Black proletariat in South Carolina. You know, you're like, there's something going on in the book which is more than just liberalism. And so at that moment, other radical groups begin to kind of adopt the book. The Black Panther Party adds Black Reconstruction on its reading list. You know, the Institute for the Black World, based in Atlanta, has become really important reading. Vincent Harding is a very important figure in that. The Communiversity in Chicago, the people are starting to read the book and at least read parts of it. And C.L.R. James, the great Marxist intellectual, is back in the United States. He's living in Washington, D.C. He teaches it, you know, in Washington, D.C. to young radicals. But what's important is that, you know, and for readers or listeners who are going to watch this, is that Du Bois was not a Black nationalist. Du Bois wasn't pushing for Black power in the sense that it was emerging in the mid-1960s. He was saying that in order for America to have genuine freedom, genuine democracy, and to be uplifted, in his words, dependent on abolition democracy. And abolition democracy was an interracial movement to basically bring social democracy to the United States. So people read Du Bois in those days, but they also read him like they read Fanon. They read the parts they like, they skipped the parts they don't like. Or they just read other people reading him. And, you know, not to cast aspersions or anything, but, you know, the kind of deep reading wasn't really kind of on the agenda until, and this is the turning point for me, a 37-year-old scholar who had just received his PhD in 1975, 2 years earlier, published a 6-page critique of Black Reconstruction in the May 1977 issue of Black Scholar. The Black Scholar was a very popular publication then. His name was Cedric Robinson. Cedric Robinson was my teacher. So in 1977, he writes this essay on Black Reconstruction, which is a book, again, published in 1935. And what he does, he says several things. He says he identifies Du Bois as an independent Marxist scholar who possessed no obligations to Marxist-Leninist dogma, nor to the vagaries of historical analysis and reinterpretation which characterized American communist thought at the time. He quotes Du Bois, and this quote is very important. This is the essence of our conversation. He says, Du Bois says in the book, what is the object of writing the history of Reconstruction? It is simply to establish the truth on which right in the future may be built. Okay? And so what Cedric took away from that text was radically different from the way it was talked about in liberal and even Black national circles. And, you know, and I want to quote this because I think it's very, very important, and I'm going to come to a close in a second. You know, he says that Du Bois's ideas concern the emergence of capitalism, the nature of revolutionary consciousness, and the nature of revolutionary organization. In Black Reconstruction, Du Bois would insist on the world historical significance of American slavery in the emergence of modern capitalism and imperialism. He would as well demonstrate historically the revolutionary force of slave and peasant laborers in opposition to a reactionary industrial working class. Finally, Du Bois would question the presumed roles of a vanguard and the masses in the development of revolutionary consciousness and effective revolutionary organization. So imagine, and by the way, this essay is then expanded, reformulated, and becomes a chapter in his book, Black Marxism, which is published 6 years later in 1983. And that text, in some ways, is foundational to the movement that we're seeing today. So in Black Marxism and in this essay, the key thing is that Cedric Robinson recognized that what Du Bois called the abolition democracy meant more than just the passage or enforcement of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. You know, and actually, abolition democracy, the way Du Bois formulated it, had the potential to extend beyond the borders of the United States, and if successful, would have ended capitalism as we know it, would have ended imperialism in its tracks, which is the expansion of capitalism. That would have happened. Abolition democracy was built on what Du Bois called the dictatorship of labor, which is not an undemocratic process. It just meant that labor ruled. Labor wasn't disenfranchised. And who was labor? The labor movement began in America with enslaved people. That was Du Bois's revolutionary insight. That's one of them. And that's what Cedric Robinson took from that. And so, you know, in some ways, he revised two tenets of Marxist thought. That is, by insisting that non-industrial workers were a revolutionary force in capitalist society, and that the destruction of slavery brought about a revolution in America, the more significant revolution than the one in 1776, you know? But it's a revolution that was defeated. And it was a revolution brought about largely by formerly enslaved people, by the Black working class. What unraveled this revolution was not the internal dynamics of capitalism, but the ideologies of white supremacy, okay? And as Cedric says, to a lesser extent, the ideologies of individualism. So those two things, so he's saying that ideology has material force. That material force of white supremacy and to a lesser extent individualism undercut the possibilities of a working class democracy that would have dismantled capitalism as we know it and put in its place something that along the lines of a revolutionary social democracy, right? Or socialism. So, you know, to jump to where we are now, we have to keep in mind that, you know, Du Bois understood the potential for transforming Marxism or those radical ideologies into something that was original and useful and incisive. You know, because in those days, it was like you're either a Marxist or you're not. You know, but they're seeing this. So the movements that emerged in the 80s and 90s, the 21st century, the movements that we see now, and I'll name some, movements like Critical Resistance, like the Labor Community Strategy Center, like Project South, Organization for Black Struggle in St. Louis, the Black Radical Congress, books like Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? In her book, Abolition Democracy, the abolitionist writings of Mariame Kaba and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, or the Black radical organizations we see today, the Dream Defenders, Black Youth Project 100, We Charge Genocide, Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity, Hands Up United, Billion Hoodies Movement for Justice, Ella's Daughters, Assata's Daughters, Let Us Breathe Collective, the Movement for Black Lives. All these movements themselves you could draw a straight line from the resurrection of Black Reconstruction, from Black Marxism, from this refusal to accept an either or, you're Marxist or you're not, you're socialist or you're not, to an analysis that recognizes the power of white supremacy, the material force of that ideology, and the danger and destructiveness of racial capitalism, right? And that is the context from the time and let's just give a personal story, you know, because I studied with Cedric, from the time I finished graduate school in 1987, that I vowed to teach Black Reconstruction every year for my career. And that text, I don't care if you're 18 years old, if you're 80 years old, I made students read it because in it was the kernel to what becomes today a revolutionary abolitionist movement that took up the vision of abolition democracy as Du Bois laid it out, that is something greater than liberalism, right? That's something transformative. And that's why people come back to the text, and that's why we have to keep coming back to it.
For folks who are reading this the first time, I also just want to note that this is a product of its time. And so there are certain, the way that Du Bois writes might not be the way that we would write it in 2020, particularly the terminology of the slaves versus what we would say today, which is the formerly enslaved or the enslaved folks. Do you want to speak, would you mind speaking a little bit to the style
Yes.
of his writing, Robin?
I will, but I also want to respond specifically to this question of the slave, because on the one hand, you are absolutely right. It's arcane in the languages. I mean, he uses, Negro. He writes in a style which is traditional for really 19th century historians, that is long block quotes, and it could be, and he also puts in data, big data. Like, when my wife was trying to read, about how many bales of cotton, she's like tripping over 4,363,717 bales of cotton in 1866. It's like, that's exactly the kind of heft and also the arcane language. On the other hand, and I think this is very important, I'm glad you mentioned slavery. He was way ahead of his time and ahead of our time still, because what he did was he might have used the word slave, but he renamed them the Black worker. He titled the chapter on the enslaved, we call it enslaved, the Black worker. And I have to say, my own feeling about that is that I find it really problematic that people will trip themselves up over distinction between a slave or being enslaved as if it changes the relationship, when it doesn't. But Black worker changes the relationship. It changes the relationship to production, it changes the relationship to capitalism, and if anything, to say the Black worker bestows a kind of dignity that the enslaved doesn't. And so in many ways, I would argue that you listen very carefully to language, and what he's doing is revising the way we think about social relationships, which is way deeper than trying to be nice about slavery.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the Read-In series. I hope that you get as much and more out of this experience as the three of us have. And so please, if you have questions, put them in the comments. Hopefully we will have attending scholars who will be able to perhaps answer your questions. Enjoy the series. Thank you.
All right, and thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Robin.
Okay, bye.
Bye. All right, bye.